Um, so hello again. This is the Following Mechanical Turks project. This is episode 23, I believe. And we're joined today by a guest, by James J. Brown Jr., who's going to speak with us, particularly in light of his recent publication, Epicrisis for an Epic Crisis. So Nathaniel, I think I'll turn it over to you to take point.
Okay. Yeah. So, well, first of all, thanks for being here, Jim.
Thanks for having me. This is great. I had to get dressed up though, because this is video, so I can't. And I'm wearing pants, but I'm not going to prove it. So
that's fine. No need to prove it. Your ethos is, in terms of pants is well established. So, I'm
wearing a shirt and tie, but I'm this close, given the way where we are now, to just getting like a Klaus Nomi just cut out that I can poke my head.
I think Zoom is doing it wrong by offering virtual backgrounds. They should be offering like virtual foregrounds.
Foregrounds.
Yeah, there we go. All right, I will mail that to myself and we'll be set. But yeah, so that as Jeremy mentioned, you have a piece in the most recent and fantastic issue of A Modern.
As do you.
Crisis. Well, I mean, and that, that I was really thinking through that, and there's lots of stuff in there that really got me thinking about the project that Jeremy and I are doing. In particular, we've over the last month or so, we've been reading up on Nardi and Ekbia's concept of Hetero Nation.
Okay.
Which is sort of something that we discovered, not late in the project, we're still ongoing, but right, their spin on automation that's neither fully automated nor fully human, and which fit into our larger kind of project, which is not necessarily, essentially what we're interested in terms of cultural techniques, which was part of that special issue, is looking at how something like Mechanical Turks draws the boundary between the human and the non-human by the way it articulates a human intelligence task. So essentially what our project isn't is going in with a sort of preloaded definition of the human and seeing whether or not what Mechanical Turks is mapping onto that, but actually seeing when it articulates what a human intelligence task is and what we've run across when it starts compensating a human intelligence task, what does it think is uniquely human, and how does that potentially not square with how we might have understood what's unique about the human. And so the original thing was not the original thing, that also is, I think, part of what your ethical programs book gets at, which a quick blurb for that.
Yeah, I mean, you didn't have to buy it. It's free online.
I know, but I wanted.
No, I can't read in a browser window. I've tried a million times.
It's
It's an awful reading experience.
Well, I like to mark it up.
Yeah.
I like to really, and I did. There's lots of foul language in the margins of this book, but in particular, one of the things that about the book that's useful for us at this stage is you break down the different kinds of, arguing about software, arguing with software, and arguing in it. And that in it is really, I think, also part of what we're interested in, which is how the software itself is creating a context in which the, distinctions between human and non-human labor are being parsed out. So that's kind of partially also why I'm interested to talk to you, is that notion of how the software itself is not simply a means we're using to make an argument, but a sort of a context or a medium that actually defines what all those key terms are. Right. So we're not using Mechanical Turks to argue what is human or what isn't. We want to be in it to see how it's shaping those distinctions. So that brings us back around to Epicrisis, which is actually kind of one of the ways I could understand it is as a kind of heteromation, which is that Twitter's got a problem of how does it manage all of the content. Well, it does some of that with, you know, what we would traditionally see as non-human actors, but then there's this whole other layer of human actors that are doing a lot of this work. And what's particularly interesting about your piece is what we're trying to do is there's also an historical arc to this, right? So the telephone operators, right? And but what they needed was their sort of tactile skills, right? Being able to put in all the things, but also things like their disposition or their voice, right? That things that they could supply that the telephone company couldn't automate or program. So I guess if you could speak more about that kind of the commercial content moderation that you described. And particularly the ways that you add elements of the ways in which this intersects with issues of gender and race too, and the ways in which what kinds of subjects were doing this kind of labor.
Yeah, so I guess the first thing I would say is that the commercial content moderation work seems like it'd be useful to you all. So Sarah Roberts, what's the other book? I'll think of his name in a second. Tarleton Gillespie. The sort of stuff on the communication side that's been a kind of account of how that labor happens would be certainly of use. So I think one of the things this is actually more about like where I would go with this piece next. So I'll start there and then we can maybe work backwards. But I've been starting to get very interested in anything that appears rote or mechanical and how that sort of how that falls apart the minute you sort of start to look at that kind of labor. So I remember many, many years ago during like a dissertation defense, talking to a student or like somebody who was defending their dissertation. I don't even remember who it was, but I remember saying, you know, what is a retweet a significant act? Now this is like early days of Twitter. Is a retweet or a fave, you know, a significant act? And everyone in the room, except for like me and the student, was like, no, it's not. It's just a click. Right. It doesn't do anything. It's just like a robotic function. And this is, of course, prior to us understand. First of all, Twitter operated differently at that point. So a retweet didn't sort of feed the algorithm the way it does now. You used to actually like follow people and see what they posted. And that was it, right? That was all. It was just a kind of timeline of the people you followed. And in fact, I was just
already nostalgic about Twitter.
Yeah, exactly. But those sorts of, even then, I think it was worth considering how what appears to be rote or mechanical or automatic is significant and is drawing the distinctions, some of the stuff that you're talking about. So I've been trying to think about other sorts of activities that would fit this sort of epicritical mode that I describe in that piece. And so for those who haven't read the piece, or just to kind of rehearse that argument, you know, epicresis is the sort of quoting of a passage and then commentary on it. And the first and most obvious example of this is the quote tweet on Twitter to say like, you know, here's what somebody said, here's what I say above it. But then I started to play with that idea as a kind of standing in for or kind of titular technique for a broader set of techniques that I start to call epicritical, which are about kind of managing the network, managing traffic. I got very excited when I started playing with that idea of epi, the sort of prefix of epi. There's a great quote in the piece from Alexander Graham Bell talking about telephone operators protecting the network.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. So all of that stuff had started to come together, and what I started to like about the piece was that, yeah, there's that block quote there, right above it, the footnote 13, that block quote. And we should just read this because the idea here was that, you know, I wanted to look at online harassment and how it was operating in spaces like Twitter. And then I started to look at previous media ecologies, and that led me to the telephone. And I started to find things like this. So Bell says, I remember very well the early telephone exchanges, which were very different from the ones that you have today. The noise and the bustle and the confusion in even a small office were very annoying. And there were other disturbing things. Also, the operators were chiefly young men or boys. So just to stop there to say, like, the bustle and loudness of the exchange is all gendered right away. And that's because boys talk back and swear and get in the way and haven't been sort of educated throughout a sort of matrix of education, from culture to schools to everything, to just shut up and like let the traffic pass through. The company got numerous complaints from subscribers that the young men or boys in these central offices would swear over the telephone. In fact, the telephone seemed especially to be designed to propagate profanity. I love that.
That's a, man, I can imagine. I mean, I'm just imagining you at the stage of this project getting to that sentence and go, "Oh yeah, no, this is
it was perfect." And actually, this came from research at the Library of Congress in the Alexander Graham Bell family archives, which was the first time I've ever done archival research of that kind. It was pretty cool. Half of it was totally useless because I can't read like manuscript handwriting. Like his handwriting and his family's handwriting is basically, like, for me, kind of unparsable. I'm amazed that people are able to do that.
Which is a whole other layer of,
yes.
Right. I mean, some of the things that Jeremy and I have been looking at with Mechanical Turks is precisely like
legibility.
Legibility. Yeah,
A lot of the Mechanical Turk jobs are essentially, a computer can't read this yet. Can you?
Can you try? Yeah. I would be actually really interested to know if there's a person out there who could tell me what those letters and documents said, because I stared at them for a long time and was like, I don't even know where to begin. It's just angled lines. I don't know.
Yeah, and Congress appears to have an F in it.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
So let's keep going. So there were not only young men, there were a few girls. And somehow or other, the soft voices of those girls served to protect the telephone company. The people at the other end of the line did not like to get the young women at the central office into trouble. And there were always far less complaints. It should be fewer, but let's not from the subscribers served by the girls than by the boys. So the girls get fewer complaints. And so little by little, the girls took the place of the boys in the telephone, has proved one of the great new occupations for women. So this gender, like the boys in the central office, lasts like for no time at all. This is like accounted for in a number of pieces that, like, they tried out the boys. No, I do think that there's that most of the historical research will say that the telegraph was manned by men. So there's this sort of gender distinction between the telegraph and the telephone right there in terms of the sort of cultural techniques of those two technologies. And then, and that's really interesting to think about, because the telegraph is ostensibly doing carrying out a similar activity, but in a very different way. Bell Telephone sold its product as a kind of as a sort of kinder and gentler way of communicating than the telegraph.
It would be interesting to see, to what degree that's interface, right? I mean, there's a sort of notion of the telegraph that's pseudo-objective. This is information that's being transmitted. There's no transmitter, right? Even though, of course, there is. Whereas this, it's interface, right? We often see women, look at the voice of Siri, right? We often see women in this interface role. They're able to mediate information transfer.
And the telegraph, there's lots to talk about in the telegraph, because people learned what do they call it, the fist of a telegraph operator. Have you guys know, right? So somebody's cadence and rhythm, you could tell based on how they do the dots and the dashes, right, who it is. Yeah. And in fact, there's evidence of like romances emerging between telegraph operators.
Oh, this also kind of reminds me of, I think it's the maintenance art of, I think it was ukuleles. Oh, gosh, I'm gonna mangle all of this. Maintenance art. Oh, good.
There it is. You're not crazy.
Yeah, that it was this sort of artistic movement foregrounding the maintenance labor work of women, right? So a lot of the art itself was like, I'm going to clean the steps of a public place.
Right.
So to take this invisible maintenance labor and make it visible and prominent.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I saw in the quote tweet, right? That like when somebody's getting harassed or trolled, or so it could be everything from an annoyance to actual sort of active harassment and abuse and sort of racist and misogynist attacks. It sort of runs the gamut. But a lot of the quote tweets that I was seeing that I was curious about were these ones that were saying like, that were quoting the person and then essentially saying like, look what I have to deal with. And it could be mocking them. It could be calling for, you know, their followers to sort of jump in and defend. It could be doing lots of different things. But I was really starting to get interested in how it was instructive material. And and in the podcast conversation I had with Calvin Pollock last week or the week before about this article, we talked a little bit about that. And he asked me about sort of how that plays into things like epideictic rhetoric. And there's a lot to think about there, because the sort of display of this material for an audience in an instructive way and in a way that is linked to values, right? So to sort of circle this back to Mechanical Turk, like how is that labor made visible? Part of that is your project, right? But that's some of what you're doing. But as the laborers themselves, I'm always interested in the people that are doing the work, that like we're not applying theory to them, but they're mounting theory themselves, right? So how are the Turks, much like Tressie McMillan Cottom, is quote tweeting people and kind of carrying out what I see to be a kind of sophisticated and well thought out technique. And that was all bolstered, by the way, by her quote tweet of the article, which I was very excited about.
Right. Yeah.
So all this is to say, like, what is the Mechanical Turks theory, the workers' theory of their labor? How are they perhaps making it visible? That's a question for you all. I don't know if you're seeing that.
No, so our first piece is looking more at, because one of the things, I mean, sort of to backtrack a little bit is that, so to answer your question, that's the second piece that's going to come out of this. So the first piece is actually looking at the Mechanical Turks sort of system itself. So one of the decisions that we've made is one of the ways of parsing all these human intelligence tasks is because we're going in and looking at the language. So we're doing some sort of, you know, we've had Scott Graham on and talking about computational rhetoric and these sort of, you know, things that we're doing. And so one of the things you can do is we can look at, you know, frequency and distribution of certain terms across all of the human intelligence tasks being offered. But you can also weight those to the number of hits that are available. So, so for instance, you might see a hit that's got certain terms in it. And those terms are either maybe less frequent, but if you weight it on the fact that there's 50,000 hits, there's 50,000 of that hit available, that term becomes much more prominent. And we're right now sort of thinking in terms of those weighted ones, because we want to get a sense not of what the Turker sees, because the Turker just sees one of those hits, but the system itself has 50,000 of them available. And so that's kind of what we're interested in now in terms of the system as a whole with those things weighted. And so what we're trying to get now, and then as Jeremy has it pulled up, one of the categories that we're using are the compensation measures.
Tiers.
So so things, you know, free ones, and oftentimes those free ones are like gateway ones, like do this, and then that will then qualify you for a more lucrative human intelligence task. And then seeing which kinds of particularly terms show up at that, you know, the 0 one, this big one that Jeremy's getting is one that's clearly bot written for other bots to do. And then when you get into the higher tiers, you get you know, you get where it becomes more associated with being able to spot branding. In the middle, you get things like, can you look at these receipts? And if you can read them, can you enter the data from them? There's, some of these we get sentiment analyses of Brave New World was popping up. Anyway, so our first approach to this is sort of looking at the system as a whole, so we can kind of get a sense of how it's within itself parsing these things. And then we have a whole other, our B pool, which has within it then a bunch of metadata that has Turkers surveying like how good a person is this to work with? Do we think the compensation levels are appropriate?
Yeah, this B pool, which we ultimately aren't including in this first thing because the data is structured differently. You get, as Nathaniel points out, this kind of meta commentary from Turkers, so it's feedback where they are in separate sort of third-party spaces, reviewing the people who are offering the jobs, whether they compensate fairly. So we have this, it was concurrent but separate when we were doing the data collection. There's less of it because it's also tougher to collect. But you can see, I mean, it's a little cryptic, but the gist of it, like TV is Turk Review, which is a third party where they aggregate to share this kind of information. TO is the same thing. I can't exactly, is it Turk or Observer? I can't quite remember. Yeah. But there are these numerical ratings of, how quickly do they pay you? How well do they compensate? It's quantitative feedback. There are also spaces where they do discursive feedback, but that's trickier to aggregate. Right?
Yeah. I was trying to think as you're describing this. I'll have to, if I can't come up with the reference while we're on this, I'll get it to you after. But there's a source on the telephone operator that talks about how kind of the minute you introduce like humans into this thing, that there will be conversations amongst the operators, and that is sort of central to the medium, not just incidental. That like these conversations that happen amongst the media, the people who are acting as the medium, are sort of crucial to understanding the medium. I'm just trying to remember where I saw that, but I'll definitely find it for you.
Yeah, so the plan is, or the scope is, to get a sense of how we think the system is articulating the distinctiveness of a human intelligence task, and then using that to develop a more qualitative approach. Not qualitative, that may not be the best way to, but actually, so we're going to look at that B pool, but we're also thinking about, how do we engage Turkers? Are there hits we could create that would also get them, which is really interesting. And this is something that when we discussed somebody, and was it Amy Evans, Jeremy, the person in the IRB office at UNC Wilmington. And what's really interesting is we were also looking at what does IRB think a human subject is, and what its definition of a human. And basically, if you're not at risk, IRB doesn't consider you a human.
Yeah.
So there's really interesting, like that becomes another, right, that even IRB is not necessarily working with a abstract definition of the human, but it generates it doing its work. And so basically we're kind of asking her what is IRB, what would IRB have to say, or what input would they want if we started engaging mechanical Turks? And there is a way in which we could approach this, in which we don't need IRB because it doesn't see the Turkers as humans, because we're not putting them at risk in collecting certain kinds of publicly available data, right? So there's all these, so whatever ends up being the human is this sort of negotiated definition that's emerging out of these sorting technologies that the various entities are using.
This is a separate project, but it might be useful to the conversation. So I've been working with some student researchers here at Rutgers Camden, and a criminal justice professor, sociologist / criminal justice, on a project that looks at online harassment, in particular, that looks at the online sort of gendered harassment of a Instagram influencer who is not a real person. Do you all know about Lowell Michaela by chance? Okay. Lowell Michaela is a sort of fake persona who presents herself as like a robot, but she's an influencer. Have you heard of this?
Yes.
Yeah. There's actually like 3 or 4 of them, and they're like put out by this company called Brood or Brud, BRUD. And they have like a whole narrative of like how they interact with each other. There's Lowell Michaela and then there's another character called like Bermuda is Bay, who was like for a while a Trump supporter and then sort of switched sides and became Lowell Michaela's friend. And Lowell Michaela is like really sort of into foregrounding LGBTQ issues. There's a million things to talk about here. However, what we were interested in was like, why are people harassing
right
someone who doesn't exist? So it's everyone knows it's a fictional character. They'll do these, and it's supposed to be a robot. So we're pretty sure it's a human body that they put another person, like a sort of 3D rendered face on, but the 3D rendered face.
It's a literal mechanical Turk. There's a person inside of it.
Yes. Yeah. They're not, because the shadowing is like perfect. So the images of her in public, like at a coffee shop with the owner of the coffee shop who she's plugging because she's an influencer, it's very clear that like that's the picture of the real person who runs that coffee shop, and that person is standing next to another real person, but they're just like using some sort of model. Excuse me. So anyway, we were really interested in studying, one, what kind of harassment happens, two, like what we might take, like why is this happening? How is it happening? Does it manifest differently because it's not a real person? My first thought was like, well, if it's happening in this space, it shows you that harassment is never has a single audience, right? It's distributed audience. Because if the audience is the person you're harassing, that's an absurd thing to do.
Right.
But if the audience is the kind of network of followers and the other people reading the comments, then it starts to make a little more sense. So to sort of cycle this back to IRB, we tried to get this study approved through IRB, and that was a nightmare. Like they were like, wait, who is what? Are these people?
Right.
And we were like, well, this isn't a real person. That's the first thing. Second of all, we want to study the comments. And right as we had put in for IRB, the EU legislation had just been passed, the regulation on privacy. I'm blanking on the name of that legislation, but the sort of, remember we all started getting emails about how everyone's privacy policy changed because of the European Union's change in regulation. So that had just happened. And so IRB was worried about the privacy of the commenters. Once we explained to them that we weren't talking about real people when it came to the person posting, then they were worried about the commenters. So much so that they rejected the study. They said, we don't see any way you can do this. Because you would have to know information about the people posting this information online, to which we responded, you've just destroyed all internet research. Like there will be no more research on the internet.
Right.
So we had to have two telephone calls with IRB to get that thing through. And one of the ways we got it through is to say that we would not we wouldn't directly quote any comment. That was how we had to get it through. So we could talk about the sort of, and other people have done this, by the way, like when doing Twitter researches.
Right.
If you do Twitter research and you directly quote a tweet, you're putting someone in harm's way, because that string can now be searched on Twitter. On Instagram, that's not the case. You can't search. But anyway, so all of that is to say this IRB problem is a major problem because IRB doesn't understand the internet. IRB doesn't understand, as you're saying, like what a human is. That changes.
Yeah.
They articulate a human depending on the study, depending on who's on the IRB board. But yeah, it was a very interesting, I don't do that much with IRB. So for me, it was especially instructive.
Yeah.
So
particularly because, I mean, that's also interesting too, because what you're in a sense, I mean, weirdly enough, I mean, no, now I'm just wildly speculating. Right, but there's a sense in which they have a very humanistic understanding, right? They see that comment as directly traceable to a person. And I just want the comments actually. I don't actually see them as intimately tied expressions of an alt. Right. I want to treat them as their own.
Yes,
Right?
especially
the comment is the sub. Right.
Right.
But they see, but there's a potential. Right? What they're seeing is like, no, this is someone's identity and their privacy needs to be protected, and we're gathering millions of comments. So one of the students we're working with is a computer science major. He did, before Instagram shut down their public API and stopped and throttled basically all like web scraping, he grabbed the first like year of Lowell Michaela's posts and comments. So we have all that data, but that data is meant to be studied at a kind of macro level, not to link any particular comment to any specific person. We're trying to do a kind of
larger scale analysis, but it doesn't, they can't think in that way. It's
Yeah.
really bizarre.
Yeah. Primarily, I guess, because I mean, IRB, I mean, really, you start tracing that history of their own technique, right? That emerges out of, you know, post Milgram, right? They're imagining
Yes.
like actual people in a room
Yeah.
getting studied. They're trying to protect.
Yeah,
right?
and harmed. Yeah, and like, not to mention that the people they are now trying to protect are perhaps people who are harassing someone else. But I mean,
which is
I get
part
it.
of what you get at in your piece too, right? That those interesting, really, you know, wicked tensions around privacy, when then privacy gets then recast out as a sort of safe house for all sorts of terrible online behavior.
It is interesting because, I mean, you know, the history of IRB is connected to Nazi trials.
Mhm.
The whole idea was gaining knowledge in a way that isn't massively abusing humans, and then it becomes potentially a kind of shield for that abuse.
So I have another question for you all, and because one of the things I've been really, both in terms of the course I was teaching this semester, which is called The Internet of Garbage, which sort of links up with e-waste and harassment and spam and anything you might call the Internet of Garbage. So part of that course in investigating that syllabus, and then also in doing work for this project, for this, whatever this broader project will be that the A Modern piece is a part of, I initially thought it was going to be called Hateware. It was going to be all about online harassment. I think it's sort of shifting, and we can talk about that in a few minutes. But anyway, part of the research I've been really sort of digging into is the stuff coming out of, like, on the communications media studies side, in particular, Andre Brock, Distributed Blackness, the book that just came out like a month ago, Sarah Florini, which is called Beyond Hashtags, like Black Digital Networks and Racial Politics. One of the things that's been coming out of that, reading that work for me, is that, and I would sort of lob this critique at my own work mostly, but perhaps at digital rhetoric in general, is like a sort of separation of technology from culture in analysis. Because that's not something I've ever, like, it's not been a focus. It wasn't a focus of my training in any way at Texas. It hasn't been a focus of my own research, that, like, you can't understand these technologies separate and apart from how people are using them and the techniques that emerged in previous historical moments. So Brock is talking about, he has an article about Black Twitter, and some of that work is in this book, but he has a sort of broader arguments about how Black digital media users are drawing on a long history of, like, navigating white supremacy and sort of being white surveillance, and kind of operating in plain view, but in ways that protect each other and that kind of keep people out. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering how much, and then that gets me to, and then Ruha Benjamin's book, the subtitle is The New Jim Code. It's Race After Technology. Also similar arguments about sort of previous techniques that inform contemporary techniques. And she, by the way, has a great chapter on robots and their, like, ties to domination and slavery. That anytime we're talking about robots, we're essentially, like, finding a way not to talk about domination, racism, and slavery. So all of that is to say, like, how much could this project start to think about those sorts of issues, and sort of not cultural techniques in the sort of sense of, Siegert, but, like, culture in the kind of, like, very situated cultures of the kinds of people, the classes of people who take up this kind of work. Is there work on that in Mechanical Turk? Like, is there evidence of that kind of stuff to talk about?
We had one of our earlier guests was Min-Soo Kang, who's a literary scholar, but did a book on, it's called Sublime Dreams of Living Machines, and precisely takes up that notion of that reading that book and looking, that's when the sort of the labor angle became a much more bigger part of the project, and the ways in which he's interested in the ways in which the definitions of automation, I mean, he kind of traces the fact that what historically what automation means is like a self-mover, right? Literally just, and now culturally it means just about the opposite, right? That you think of an automaton as someone that
you can push around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he goes, and that's totally tied to, labor and organizing labor and keeping labor from being organized, that all those, and so what he's interested in is that tension between how the cultural imagination shapes the development of particular machines, but then how those machines in turn affect. So there's a period where actually people start using the language of vegetable to describe not how we would use it, right? You describe a vegetable, you're thinking of either someone in a coma, but it was actually used to mark someone that was the opposite, because they weren't because machines were everywhere. The vegetable then becomes this site of organic autonomy. As you actually people start using the language of vegetables to describe the opposite. So how these, and you can see these things flipping back and forth through various, but his book stops, the conclusion of his book is sort of up to like World War I, World War II. And then once you get kind of after that, then you get into computers and things like that. And so we've started to do some digging into, and this is part of the second project, we'll be sort of looking into the, the demographics of mechanical Turks and,
Because I'm assuming that, I mean, if previous media ecologies tell us anything, it's that we know what that's going to look like, right? we pretty much know who's this labor is being foisted onto, and that who will vacate those positions, and then just when they become completely, like when they're not lucrative anymore, and as automation creeps in and takes over those tasks. What happened with the telephone was it was boys for like a minute, and it was white women.
Right.
And then when the telephone switches got automated, the white women fled, and then it was black women and Latinx women, and now pretty much all automation. And I would imagine that those dynamics will play out in similar ways. It also makes me think of the, of course, then of computing. I was thinking there's a great passage in Wendy Chun's I can't remember which one, not the most recent one, the one before, where she's talking about one of the computers starts to like cheat. She's like not doing exactly what she's told, but and she's sort of skipping steps in the computation. And for Chun, that's like obviously a really instructive moment, because she's acting like she's exerting agency in a way that no one's comfortable with, so she gets fired. That's worth looking at too.
Yeah, because we've also discovered too is looking at some interesting sort of the Hetero Nation. They come out of political economy, so they're kind of there's things that we like and some things we push back against, but they also have, so they see like something like mechanical Turks and content moderation as related to things like ATMs and self-checkouts. So what you see is you don't necessarily see human labor being simply replaced by machines, but it's being like replaced. So so you think about like a teller replaces a human, like an ATM replaces a human. It doesn't.
Right.
It gets rid of the teller and then makes the customer now is the teller. So it's not replaced a human. It's just changed the human that does it. Right. And so that's kind of what you're tracing with the telephone, right? There's still always kind of a human there. It's just, so right now, right, the automated, press 1 for, there's still a switch.
Yeah.
It's you, it's the customer now, not the, so it's the human is never removed.
Right. In fact,
another human is now doing it.
Yeah, well, it's like automatic checkout at the grocery store. There's always the human at the front who's got to step in because the thing's not working the way it's supposed to, because it doesn't.
Still but the ways in which these things become cost saving, it basically turns the customer into the laborer. Right.
Well, so that's really interesting with regard to the telephone, by the way, because the first automated switch, I don't think this made it into the A Modern piece. So I was trying to write a longer version of A Modern piece that was going to be one of those University of Minnesota little books.
The Forerunners.
Yeah, the Forerunners.
I would if you get a Forerunner book, I won't talk to you ever again.
So I had, it was kind of on there was moving in that direction, and then they changed editor. The editor who was working in that series, she stepped down, and they hired a new editor, and the new editor was not as into it as the old editor. But the first automated switch was called the Strauger, or one of the first automated switches was called the Strauger switch. It was developed by this guy named Strauger, who was angry that he's like a funeral director, and one of his friends died, and he didn't get the funeral. Like, he didn't get the business for the funeral because in his mind, I mean, this all might be apocryphal, but this is the story people tell, that the telephone operator was the girlfriend of the competing funeral director, and she connected the call to the other guy, not to Strauger. And for Strauger, this was like, he's pissed for any number of reasons, but primarily because like this woman had the audacity to like make a decision, like to actually like do something. Back to the sort of Chun example of the computer who's like acting. And so he's like, well, screw this. Like, I'm going to automate this whole process so that we don't need operators anymore. And he said, he has a great quote about like, he developed the first switch that involves no petticoats.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So he develops this switch, this automated switch. It pretty much flops, and it flops because it requires too much expertise on the part of the caller, because all that work that had to be done by the operator now has to be done by the caller. They have to like hit buttons or swing the sort of dial in a certain sequence and in the exact right way to make the connection, which all still happens right today. It's just that all of that sort of is automated. And so it failed because it pushed expertise outward, and people weren't good at it. They were quite bad at it, and they couldn't get the calls connected. So it's just another example of what you're talking about, which is that automation replaces,
it's all, I mean, the Amazon language of artificial intelligence is,
it's fake artificial intelligence.
Of all the things to be mad at Amazon about, and there are many, the fact that they just called it Mechanical Turks is, I mean, it's so brazen. They're just like, we'll call it after this, And actually, what's interesting, what we've learned too, is to call the Mechanical Turks a hoax. Is everybody knew it was a guy in there. They were just fascinated by how it worked.
Yeah,
there's very little evidence that it fooled anybody.
Have you? Are either of you watching Debs, the show Debs?
It's on my
list.
Yeah. So when you get to Debs, there's it's good. I liked it a lot. But there's like a couple heavy-handed moments of like these computer programmers don't understand culture or history or and as heavy-handed and sort of clunky as that gesture is, I at least appreciated the gesture of it's trying to tell that story, to say like, I mean, it's obviously true. There's one character in the show you'll see who's like, the one who knows poetry, and he sort of stands in for all of us. But anyway, it's interesting that the sort of complete lack of like historical knowledge and context when like naming this and understanding anything about what you're doing when you make that kind of
it was just I guess they thought it was neat, but it's actually been, for us, it's a huge way in, which is also interesting that the Shannon Mattern piece that was in the A Modern about the different kinds of desks and how they're also tied to gender and secrecy was also kind of piqued my interest, in terms of the Mechanical Turk was actually this really well-designed cabinet with all these secret compartments open like a magician, right? Look, there's nobody inside, and how the way the thing worked.
How it gets, all the different ways it gets hidden, not just that it's hidden.
But there's all those sorts of interesting histories of how that works. And the instance of cheating is really interesting, because there's still a famous moment when Kasparov was playing, I think, Deep Blue. And there's a moment when, I think was that the Russian chess player that would play at IBM. And there's a moment when he basically called Mechanical Turk on them,
because it did something that it shouldn't have done, or he didn't expect.
He felt was that what it just did was intuitive.
Yeah, creative.
He said, there's a tiny man inside that. I don't believe that, right.
Mhm.
But all that, of course, is interesting for us because it all hinges upon what his operating definition of a human is, right?
Yeah.
What activates his raising his hand going, that's human. Something's happened here that I think is, and we're really interested in how that moment where it crosses whatever that boundary is. But
that's why, we were looking at that from both ends with the, the daughter. Remember the mechanical daughter?
Descartes'
daughter, right?
Mm-hmm.
That there's blurring on both ends, right? Because not only do you start to anthropomorphize the object, but you start to objectify the human, right? Where the blur becomes bi-directional. I no longer assume this is. I'm assuming this is a bot by default now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, that's the Habeas Viscus book by Alexander Whaley, right? That whole notion of that particular Western notions of humanism, you're going to result in lots of people not meeting muster.
Yeah.
That humanism is like, if you've got a certain definition of the human, you might very well find humans that don't meet it, right? If it's tied to, certain kinds of rationality or certain kinds of ableism, right? So there's that notion that the human it literally cuts both ways in terms of, I can use it to grant more humanness to non-humans, but I'm also simultaneously using it to take it away from other kinds of bodies that don't
inherently, right? I mean, any definition you draw is going to do that. Right?
Mm-hmm. I was also thinking about there's a great Turing quote about how I was just trying to find it while we were talking here about how like people will say that computers are incapable of surprise. They can't surprise you. And he basically says like the only people that would say that are people who've never worked with computers. Like computers take me, he said something like computers take me by surprise all the time. That like
so all these parsings keep reparsing it, right?
Right.
There's no final
So I was thinking like when you asked me to do this, I was thinking about what would be like the most useful from like the A modern piece as you guys were working through all of this. And I was thinking about whether I'm trying to figure out if the term epicritical is a one that will sort of have legs. Because it's sort of, it's nice to sort of play with it in this article and see if it kind of gets traction both for me and for others to think about like a broader category. Because it's, it started as like, oh, wow, epicresis is a thing. I didn't know, I don't really know rhetorical figures very well. I just go reference books that talk about them.
Zug was one of them, but I don't know.
I don't know what it means.
I mean, what it allowed you to do, by the way, was really nicely like just drop some rhetorical theory on the A modern.
Yeah, in a way that never happens because rhetoric is just like can't find a way into the broader media studies conversation at all. And the only way it does is through like Paul Ricoeur's version of like rhetoric or something.
So whereas
I only know them by text. I only know them by reading since I mangled that word is one of the first things.
I don't even know if I'm not 100% sure that I'm saying it correctly. It sounds Greek if you say epicresis. So
I think so. I think that sounds right. You just say the C's differently.
Yeah.
Whereas in Casey and I's piece, we were hiding our light under a bushel basket. You were just like, boom,
here it is.
Rhetorical figure. Here you go.
But so it started because I was like, okay, there's a way, the rhetoricians have a way to describe this thing that I'm seeing. And then I tried to kind of zoom out a little bit to think about epicresis and epicriticals as a way to think about all the different ways that all of these techniques for managing the network and protection. And so some of the examples I've been trying to like, if this book is that I'm working on, if it's a book even, I don't even know what it is. If this project I'm working on is like, is about this broader category of stuff, Mechanical Turk would fit probably nicely into like a version of what I'm thinking about. But some other examples, just to sort of throw a few out there and maybe brainstorm others to understand this broader category of labor that I've been thinking about, are things like content warnings and trigger warnings that are about kind of packaging content for other people. Maybe it's things like, early blogging did this kind of work. Like there was a lot of like the early, like blogs were really about just like grabbing a passage and saying like, look at this. And that's really all a blog was for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, even like the logic of Tumblr, right? It's just that
Tumblr and reblogging, right? That was another one of those moments where it's like just clicking the reblog button on Tumblr feels like a low stakes activity, but it's not. It's not at all, because it feeds that content to other networks. It feeds the algorithms that are trying to parse out what kind of activity is happening on this network.
Jim, do you by any chance, do you know the story of Xanadu, the technological project?
Yes, the Ted Nelson project.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of interesting because, their framework, as much as it's intelligible, was, you'd be assembling pieces from everything all together, right, to form new stuff. So that way things could be tracked and even monetized. I mean, they were thinking of this pre-hypertext, well, not pre-hypertext, but pre-internet. Thinking about, you could even monetize this because everything would be associated with a kind of originating source, and then it could be cut together.
That's interesting. I do have to go back to that. And then the Memex too, I guess, would be kind of part of that.
That also reminds me of the style of writing now that happens in lots of tech com, where you use content management, right? And you've got all these various parts that tech writers are just writing components of a document. They never actually see the whole document, and then someone up top then pulls, I need this executive summary, I need this, and then pulls them all and then assembles them into
content management.
Yeah. And then so the head writer is a content manager. Is just and of course that's another version of this labor too, which is the people who are like watching videos of freaking like beheadings and so that we don't have to. So I was just thinking like about that term, whether it's so there's the sort of, is the term theoretically useful and interesting, and then there's the other question, which is just more sort of pragmatic, which is like, is it too rhetorical to get any legs outside of our conversation?
I think, it all just depends on how it gets, reblogged.
It's true.
I think what really jumped, in the opening paragraph of your piece, the second half of it, I don't know if Jeremy can even pull this up.
You can get in there. Yep.
Okay.
And this is in my notes that, the very fact that this work seems to be managed in this way indicates that this labor goes well beyond the verbs we often attach to it. This next sentence is sort of key for where we're at in our project, right? Filtering, sorting, classifying, right? We're kind of even looking at these, right? We've got these pairs we're looking at, right? What's the difference between transcribe and summarize, or these, so filtering, sorting, classifying don't fully capture what's happening in these factories of toxicity, since these terms don't evoke a core part of this labor interpretation. And that's kind of that, filtering, sorting, classifying, interpreting, right? What kind of continuum is, how are those getting parsed up? And what's really interesting in Mechanical Turks is, and we've also been looking at Polanyi's paradox. This, which is to get back our sort of helpful way into this, is actually thinking about the current moment, the notion of essential versus non-essential labor.
How that's changed, obviously, in COVID-19. Suddenly,
rearranges. Whereas in certain systems, you'd have a grocery worker and a doctor would be, in terms of how they might be, in terms of cultural, right? They're now here. Right. So that notion of what's high skill. So what's interesting is in Mechanical Turks, we're seeing well-compensated labor that really needs the unique sensing apparatus of a human body. Right. That what makes you human is actually not some kind of interpretive act. It's, you've got a better ocular sensor. So these weird ways in which work is being parsed up. So there's certain kinds of so we were looking at words like extract and seeing that potentially as whatever weird orbit or continuum we're working with, that extract might be really far away from some of these surveys that are asking people to describe how they feel about Hurricane Harvey.
We had a project that was based on sort of cognitive tasks. So transcribe seems to be a lower order cognitive task than interpret. but we're not, that's not a clean division. I mean, we're starting to see where, you know, the sense data is in some cases as valuable as what we would call sort of, you know, cognitively more intense tasks.
Right. That basically being able to do a sentiment analysis of Henry James, which is up there, right, can sometimes be just as compensated or less compensated as, can you read this receipt and pull out, right? And if we're thinking from a certain kind of knee-jerk response, my instinct would be as a mechanical Turk would have those at opposite poles, right? But it doesn't, because whatever it thinks is a human intelligence task is based on the particular needs that's being generated in that software. Right? It's so that's some really interesting. So that and in
the software and in the task. So every task rearranges these categories, right? So every single task redefines. That's really interesting to me. Every task redefines human. Yeah.
So in each human intelligence task, the human is always at stake.
Yeah.
Yep. It's an invocation, you know.
The humanness is articulated through the task.
Or
in it, I guess, to use that kind of, to use your preface.
Yeah, the ethical programs language. But what's interesting is that that's the end of ethical programs, like the about within. But that's just where that's where the book arrives.
Yeah.
But it doesn't do anything with that. It just says, like, here's what we should look at. We should look at how software shapes and is shaped by activity. And in fact, the eventual move of the conversation into cultural techniques is a really interesting way to then think about, because cultural techniques wasn't top of the sort of media studies conversation when I was writing that book. It was not, at least not in English. It wasn't German. It hadn't been translated yet, and it wasn't really getting uptake. But in fact, the cultural techniques conversation does push on that a little bit further. So whereas I'm just saying, like, oh, we should understand that these things happen in software, that software sort of envelops these activities. And I never did, I just pointed to it. I didn't do anything with it.
No, but I think it points to, like, epicrisis, right? That's its robustness is, you know, we can pick up that three-part system you develop and, like, oh, we can get some shit done with this.
Yeah. I think so. You know, the other thing, this isn't really related, but it's something I wanted to ask you all, since you're, so I looked at a little bit of your introduction, which is the chunk where you're talking about sort of trying to find a way to align ant and cultural techniques. Is that right? Like,
I think that's sort of in part, or the antish is we want to, right, we're not going to bring to mechanical Turks.
Right.
You know, we want it to tell us what it thinks, right? The fall of the act, tell us what you think a human is.
Right.
So it's antish in that kind of, right? And then we want to kind of follow the Turkers as they do it. So it's sort of, right, Latour's move of, if you can't use the social to explain what's happening, the social is what's at stake.
Right.
So that's kind of our, you know.
Yeah, it's good. So I asked that because there's a section of Seegert's, the book about cultural techniques, where he talks about the telephone, that I've been sort of struggling with and, like, trying to figure out what the hell he's doing. I eventually sort of got to what he was doing, but the reason I was confused by it was he was talking about the kind of, he cites a passage of, it's Kafka talking about a dream. I don't know if you remember this part from the book, but Kafka has this dream where he goes to a bridge and there are two telephone receivers, and he puts one up to each ear and, like, says that all he hears is, like, this noiseless, like, it's just noise. And that's for Siegert and for Kafka, like, that's the essence of of communication and of the telephone, is pure noise. But for me, like, so I started thinking about that passage and thinking about the operator and how, I mean, so this gets back to your question of how each activity, or your not question, your assertion, that, like, each activity rearranges what counts as human and what counts as sort of activity. Because the only way to think about the telephone as sort of pure noise is to ignore all the actions that went into connecting the call. Right. So, like, but then I realized that he was talking about direct phone lines. So like, no switch, building A connected to building B.
Right.
And you just pick up the phone and yell until somebody comes to the
The cans with the string between.
basically that's what he's talking about. Yes.
Yeah.
But it got me thinking about cultural techniques and how, I mean, I guess this is why it's useful. Like it's sort of techniques all the way down, I guess, is like each time you think you have identified the noise or the third out of which communication is sort of, or meaning is plucked.
Yeah.
There's just another layer below that, I guess. Does that make sense?
And that I think is, and you know, this may or may not resonate. I mean, that's sort of what, at least when we were having the cultural techniques conversations, that I think marks cultural techniques as particularly useful for rhetoric, right? In the sense that it's right. You're imagining like a Plato potentially not liking cultural techniques because it's at some point there's a form underneath that the technique is operating on, and techniques
right.
like, no, there's no pure form here, right? There's no love that's then enacted. There's
right.
people doing love, and that's what it is after the fact.
Right. Yeah, that's
So
interesting.
it resonates for me with rhetoric in that sense, that there's, you know, the kind of Lanham sort of strong defense of rhetoric, right? There's no like justice, and then rhetoric either serves it or doesn't.
Right. It's all in
act. It's like, well, where'd justice come from? Well, some more rhetorical technique
right.
That's
all the way
generating
down.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That's interesting.
And so that's what kind of strikes us. And I think that's the either subtle or explicit rhetoric here, is that notion of the human is not it's not the cause of what's happening. It's this continual rhetorical effect of right, the humans getting produced rhetorically.
It would be really interesting.
But as you point out, it's being produced rhetorically in like in a system that needs certain tasks completed.
Yeah. I was just thinking like, it would be interesting to have like almost like a visualization tool where like when you clicked on a task, it would somehow demonstrate the assumptions made about humanity in that task. Because right, that like each time you, it's almost like it was like you know Darius Kazemi's work. He's Tiny Subversions on.
Yeah.
He makes weird internet stuff. This would be a Darius project where like he would build a sort of widget that every time you clicked on a hit, like a mechanical Turk hit, it would say like, oh, this is what this hit thinks a human is.
Right. Then you tie it to a set of, we'd go to the noun project and get a set of icons, and
yes.
Right. The human being here is an eyeball. I mean, I wonder now if there's actually ways of looking at like synecdoche, right? The ways in which a part is taken for the whole.
Mm-hmm.
Right. In this hit, the eyeball is what's human. In this hit, it's your feelings that are right. There's a bunch of mental health hits that are really interesting.
I mean, returning to the IRB, a lot of what's valuable on Mechanical Turk is your trauma, right? Because humans experience trauma in the way that a machine doesn't now and maybe never will.
Yeah, what was that piece? I forget whether it was in Wired or Fast Company, but right, Mechanical Turks got me to relive my worst trauma for 50 cents an hour or 50 cents a task or something like that.
It was about
that's well compensated labor, right? 50 cents is
for a hit, for a task.
That's making it rain as far as Mechanical Turks is concerned. But it's well, and it's totally bound up in, I mean, a lot of the hits are Mechanical Turks is, I mean, it may be that when I was in college, the joke was that most psychology is about American undergraduates at large state universities.
Yes. Yeah, because that's who signs up for the studies, right? Yeah.
It's most psychology is now, it's no longer students doing it for extra credit. It's Mechanical Turkers doing it for a nickel. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was just that's, the whole kind of segment of what some of the stuff we looked at as, how this is manifested in other fields. There's started to be sort of a critical backlash in terms of, instead of having your Psych 101 students do this, just put it on the Turk and you'll pay a couple of dollars. But then, if you're a Turker and you want to get through things as fast as you can, why not just set up a bot to take your psychological, I mean, all you have to do is game the system such that, you're not just giving the same C every time. You just have to give enough variance.
Right.
So the other bot doesn't think that you are a bot.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we read. I taught an undergrad course in the fall about. I teach such happy courses. This semester was the Internet of Garbage, and the fall was like Truth and Lies in the Digital World. But a lot of the research on trying, like, trying to kind of account for how people interpret content online. Like it gets offloaded onto, or people trying to figure out the sort of information silo type research. Yeah, they're pushing it onto Mechanical Turks, but then of course the next question is like, and this gets back to the demographics of the Mechanical Turk system. Like, what biases are built into the people who self-select as Mechanical Turk workers? That's why I'm really interested in the sort of cultural question of who these people are and what sort of cultural sort of habits are informing the hits as they're carrying them out.
Yeah.
Because that's what's been interesting to me in the work that I was pointing you to earlier. People like Brock and Sarah Florini and Ruha Benjamin are saying, a lot of the work in media studies especially you just think of it in the rhetoric conversation. There's cultural rhetorics, and there's digital rhetorics, and there are some people who do a little bit of both of those things, but there are very few people who do them together and see them as integrally tied. I certainly haven't until very recently. And if our use of the tool and the tool's use of us is sort of perpetually sort of in flux and in conversation, then we need to understand the cultural practices that are informing the tool and reshaping the tool, which Twitter is a perfect example, because like most of what Twitter does now is the tool absorbing practices like hashtags, like retweet, like quote tweets, like everything that people do. And oh, by the way, like a large, vast chunk of that, especially on Twitter, is African-American cultural practices, signifying, and like all of that stuff is now absorbed into the software because Twitter said, oh, wow, hashtags are a great idea. Let's make those clickable. Like that wasn't a Twitter idea. That was a user's idea.
Yeah.
And so I that's why I'm really super interested in how that's happening in Mechanical Turk.
I think right there is sort of the merging of epicrisis or epicritical work, Mechanical Turks, and then that Hetero Nation stuff, right? The ways in which particularly, and what links them, at least from a lot of what we've been looking at, is the value generated by that, right? So so what happens is almost retroactively that use of the hashtag becomes a human intelligence task. That then gets, because oftentimes particularly what Jeremy's been spotting is the number of hits that are basically designed to train bots. I mean, that's all, like the captive technology is just prove you're not a human, but all that information, every time I click on a motorcycle, that's part of training a bot to recognize motorcycles. Right? So the very thing I'm using to prove I'm a human will one day not get that job done by virtue of the labor I did to prove I'm not a human.
Yeah, amazing.
Right.
Yeah.
And that I think is what links all this together, right? That so much of the human intelligence tasks are being used to actually generate something that won't be artificial intelligence, but
will be
Platonic way of viewing that as a tragedy, right? That, I mean, it's as though we're standing on a platform and we're continually sawing off around ourselves, right? But I mean, I'm not sure we have to view it as that kind of attenuation, right? That it's, I mean, this is all still our system, right? I mean, the questions are just how different components of that system are contributing to it in different ways, right? Yeah, so there's a way to view this not as being terrifying.
Well, that's the point you all were making a few minutes ago, which is that just it's a constant rearticulation of the human that is situation and task specific. That is not, as you're saying, Jeremy, not eroding the definition of human, but just demonstrating that there isn't one. There just isn't a definition. There just doesn't exist.
Which I think is then, I mean, that's where then the kind of cultural analysis becomes. I mean, that's in the epicritical work, right? Okay, now how then does each articulation, what are the consequences of that articulation for certain people?
Yes, who's carrying it out? How are they carrying it out? How are they reshaping the task based on previous tasks, previous skills, previous media ecologies that have trained people to act in certain ways, that have encourage certain behaviors and not others. This actually gets at a question that I don't know if it's applicable to what you're doing, but it's something I've been trying to think about, which is like, what's the opposite of epicritical work? Labor. Like if epicritical labor is about managing the network so that we all can use it, that's from commercial content moderation to clicking buttons to report bad actors on Twitter and Facebook. All of that is sort of part of epicritical work in, say, social media spaces. What's the opposite of it, or what's the labor, or if not labor, then like activity that sort of pushes against it? One example I've been thinking about is the well actually tweet, which is like the sort of opposite of an epicritical, as I'm reading it, is to sort of, I say this in the article, it lets the content through, even if it's hateful and spiteful content, it lets it through and comments on it, right? The well actually is a roadblock. Is not letting anything through. It's saying, well, actually, you're wrong, and here's why. So it's a stopping of content.
I wonder if, this would be the link to, my first instinct early on was like, given the kind of it's all cultural techniques all the way down, there's a certain sense in which there isn't an opposite of
True
critical work, right? The well actually is still kind of, you could see it as, but I'm wondering if there's links to the epicritical to the epideictic. If the well actually is like forensic, right? It's
interesting.
Right.
Interesting.
The forensic is designed to like, this is either right or wrong, right? The forensic is not designed to praise or blame something, which essentially keeps it circulating in the commons, right? That's critical work keeps the culture going by either right, the words we would use, right, by either boosting certain signals or not.
That's great. Because
actually is like a forensic, like no, I want this settled.
Well, and temporally, right? Because those map to potentially temporalities, right? If you see the epideictic as present and the forensic as past, this is the statement. It is now contained versus this is now the present of the epideictic.
Yeah, and also, so this came up in the podcast conversation with Calvin Pollock as well, the epideictic, which is like that all the work that's gone into kind of redefining or making the epideictic a little bit more complicated, right? So to make it not just about display or celebrate or praise and blame. Jeff Walker's work. There's a bunch of people who have tried to say that, like, Aristotle's epideictic is sort of impoverished, right? So
there's the
Brooke Rollins has a piece that I just stumbled back onto, which is really good. Brooke Rollins. She has a piece on epideictic.
I don't have my giant binder. I'm also interested in epideictic.
Okay. With
my locative media stuff.
Oh, cool.
Right.
Because it's about place and space.
But he doesn't know where to put it. So it's about place, but it doesn't have one. It's essentially so it's also where Aristotle's need to put it in threes makes epideictic really interesting.
So I just want to hang with this question for one more second, because I'm gonna make this about me.
This is the make it about you portion. Jeremy, can you play the make it about me zinger? Big stinger we've got.
Yeah, you got it. You guys play drops, and we can make this like a full-on radio.
Don't worry, we'll fix it in post.
But this does link back to what you were saying earlier, which is to say that all this stuff gets rearranged in the moment, like just like the human gets rearranged or recategorized or rearticulated. So if the well actually is forensic, it's forensic for a particular audience,
right?
But it's epideictic for another audience. So because the people, if your well actually tweet is to tell a Black woman that she's wrong, then it's epideictic for your people.
Right.
I had never really thought of it that way until you started sort of like, so all of this is, I should have thought of it that way because it's rhetoric. Everything's sort of audience driven and specific. That's really interesting.
Because there's the way in which, because there's also, right, as you even nod to, right, the epicritical, the quote tweet is also the dunk tweet.
Yes.
Which feels very much forensic in the sense in which it makes static the original tweet and then slams.
Yes.
There's a sense in which, from a certain perspective, the quote tweet is another kind of actually tweet. Well, actually, this is racist, or so that
all of this is perfect because what people want Twitter to be is deliberative.
Right.
but it's not.
No.
It's never, and it like people are like, oh, well, they mourn the fact that it isn't,
Right.
or they want it to be, so they try to make it that. But
that's not the standard, right? How is this tweet going to help us to do? That's
Yes.
not what I'm doing here.
That's not what it's for. It's not and that, by the way, to go back to Andre Brock's book, he says that like what's so interesting about Black activity on Twitter is that Black users are making Twitter. He says they make Twitter do what it do, meaning they're not contorting the tool. They are actually using the tool in the most efficient way and effective way possible. That's not a perversion of Twitter. It is Twitter. Black Twitter is Twitter.
Grim Bell quote, right? The telephone seems designed to propagate profanity.
Yes. So yeah, exactly, totally.
That's my general argument, is that rhetoric is never deliberative either. That's
right.
The idea of that's because constantly, I mean, I think a lot of the work that we do, someone like, this isn't rhetoric. Well, why isn't it? Well, because it's not deliberative. Yeah, that's just one of the things that some dude made up.
It's just a tiny slice of what rhetoric is, and you all want it to just be that. It's the least interesting.
Yeah. It's epicrisis all the way down.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, well,
on that note,
I hope that this was helpful.
No, this was,
because we've been looking for frameworks, I think. I mean, one thing we've been able to do is generate all this stuff, right? I mean, we've got all these observations, and we started to work them into a shape. But what we need are things like explanatory frameworks. So we were looking at, Hetero Nation, but then we were running into some difficulties there. Last time we were kind of looking again at the Polanyi's paradox, because the way it re-articulates labor. I think largely what we're looking for, these kind of interpretive frameworks that help us explain what we're seeing in particular ways or understand them.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yeah, that's because, I mean, we're kind of at this epicritical moment where we're stuck because there's really no way forward now that isn't, well, this is what we see, but that's because how we weighted the data.
Oh, yes.
Right. But it's not rigged. It's there, but it's how are we quote tweeting this massive Excel spreadsheet now?
Yeah.
Right.
Well,
And that's, and partially, I think, we keep looking for frameworks. Partially, I think, I don't know, I can speak for Jeremy. We're now at the precipice of this, and it's now like, data collectors' remorse is about to click in, because we're kind of at the point now where once we pick, we're in that now. We're in this particular, we've now gone with this category, with this frequency measure, and now we got to write the thing.
It's always the case that it's like, surprise, surprise, I found the answer that matches precisely the question I was looking for. I mean, it's like, once you make that choice, everything else kind of unfolds. So for those choices.
Yeah. Right. Well, thanks, Jim.
This was fun.
It's on a Friday morning.
Well, hey, I'm not super busy unless I'm teaching second grade to my child.
Right.
I'm mostly,
if you guys need help with antonyms. So, and as always, I appreciate your cardigan game. And
this is for you.
Appreciate that. It's too hot in my office right now. So,
all right, guys. Well, good luck, and I'll keep following.
Also, we'll see you on the internet.
All right, cool.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
See ya. Okay. Well, that was great.
Yeah. Good
So
stuff.
I think something we could pull out of it is potentially there's some interpretive frameworks we might be able to use.
No, and quickly, and I know you got to go. I mean, I also liked, that was, I think, the first, and probably hopefully not a good thing that shouldn't be unexpected after 23 of these things, is that I think the work that we're doing was also helpful for Jim. So they get a sense that this might actually be useful for people was nice.
Yeah, I mean, right. I mean, ideally, the project is useful, even if he's not going to contribute directly to it or, pull any of our data or anything. It can be potentially useful as a demonstration of something that's going on in Mechanical Turks. It can be rolled in that way.
Okay. Well,
so just briefly, I guess, where do we go from here, do you think?
I mean, we need to start writing up stuff.
Yeah, which as the semester ends, that may be more of a feasible possibility.
Yeah, that's why I tried to get Jim in now because I think we're kind of in a little bit of a holding pattern before we can really dig into this. So, because I think the next step will involve needing to zero in on this a little bit and give it some space in my week to do. So,
well, I mean, you're more familiar with that material. If you want to, read and think about that, I can hopefully, although who knows what time I'll have, keep mucking with the data to try and see what's going on in those hits, and try and pull out.
Yeah, no, I think that's the move now, is as we discussed before. Now that we've got the weighted and the non-weighted ones that have some of those frequencies, I think what I've started to do now is tracking down those hits and looking back into them, and so I think that's a good place to be right now.
Okay, all right. Well, we will talk later.
All right, bye.
Yeah, see you. Great,
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Good app.
Good app. All right, I'll see you.
Bye.